She interrupted the trial and shouted, "The stepfather is Lee, what the girl?" Revealed shocked everyone. Subscribe to the channel, share this video and write in the comments where you are watching us from. Amina sat on the living room floor, her small hands carefully arranging colored pencils in a neat row. Her mother, Leela, hummed softly in the kitchen as the smell of cinnamon and vanilla filled the air. It was their Saturday morning tradition: pancakes with syrup, fresh fruit and laughter echoing through the house. Leela would dance around the kitchen, twirling with a wooden spoon as if it were a microphone, singing old R&B songs while Amina giggled and clapped along. The house was warm and alive, filled with vibrant colors and personal touches that made it feel like a haven. Framed pictures of their family adorned the walls, most of them featuring Lila and Amina smiling side by side. On the bookshelf sat a collection of books about strong black women in history, which Lee often read aloud to Amina at bedtime. She wanted her daughter to grow up proud of her heritage and unafraid to embrace who she was. Layla's voice rang out from the kitchen, cheerful and light. "Amina, come taste this batter, I think it's our best one yet." Amina jumped to her feet, her braids bouncing as she ran to the kitchen. She dipped her finger into the bowl and tasted it, scrunching her nose before breaking into a grin. "It's perfect, Mama." Lila leaned down and kissed her forehead. "That's because it's made with love," she said, wiping a smudge of flour from Amina's cheek. Everything about that morning felt safe, it felt whole, but nothing would ever be the same again. The following Monday, Lila kissed Amina goodbye at the school gate, promising to pick her up early so they could visit the park. Amina skipped into her classroom, clutching the new coloring book her mother had given her that morning. By lunchtime, the principal walked into the classroom, her expression serious. She whispered something to the teacher, who immediately turned toward Amina with soft, worried eyes. The principal beckoned her and Amina's stomach tightened. In the office, a tall man with a sharp jaw and piercing blue eyes stood by the window. His hands were shoved into his pockets and he didn't look at her when she walked in. She knew him. Greg, her stepfather. He had married her mother just a year earlier, but he had never felt like family. "Amina," the principal said, her voice careful and measured. "There's been an accident." Amina blinked at her, then turned to Greg. "Where's Mama?" Her voice trembled. Greg finally looked at her, his expression blank and cold. "She's gone," he said flatly. The words didn't make sense. Gone where?" Amina shook her head. "No, she's not. She was coming to get me. She's dead," he interrupted. "It was a car accident, that's it. You're coming home with me." Tears flooded her eyes as she stumbled back, but Greg didn't move to comfort her. He just waited, his eyes sharp and impatient. The drive home was silent. Amina sat curled in the back seat, hugging her backpack as tears streamed down her face. Greg didn't speak. He didn't turn on the radio. He didn't even glance at her through the rear-view mirror. When they pulled into the driveway, the house that had once been warm and full of light now looked foreign. The curtains were closed and the garden had already begun to wilt. Amina stepped inside and felt the air shifted. Was heavy, cold. Greg dropped his keys on the counter and turned to her. "Go to your room." "But I now." The sharpness in his voice made her flinch. She hurried down the hall and into her bedroom, shutting the door behind her. She stared at the walls, still covered with colorful drawings and posters her mother had hung. But the room no longer felt like hers. That night Amina cried herself to sleep, clutching her teddy bear. She kept waiting for her mother to walk through the door to tell her was all a mistake, but no one came. The days blurred into each other. Greg barely spoke to her, and when he did, it was to give orders or scold her for something trivial, leaving her shoes by the door, spilling juice on the counter. He stopped cooking for her, instead leaving cans of soup or dry cereal on the table as if expecting her to fend for herself. Amina tried to hold on to the memories of her mother. She drew pictures of her, wrote letters she couldn't send, and whispered prayers at night asking for her to come back. But Greg made it clear that any mention of Lila was forbidden. "She's dead," he snapped one evening when Amina tried to ask about her mother's favorite song. "Stop bringing her up. His voice was sharp and final, and Amina knew better than to argue. Over time the house grew darker. Greg removed most of Lee's things, her clothes, her books, even the framed photographs that had lined the shelves. It was as if he wanted to erase her entirely. Amina felt invisible. She avoided him as much as possible, spending most of her time in her room or outside when she could sneak away. But even outside wasn't safe. The kids at school started to echo some of the things Greg said. At home they mocked her hair, her skin, and the way she spoke. One boy called her dirty and another said his dad told him people like her didn't belong. Amina wanted to tell someone. She wanted to tell her grandmother Evelyn. But Greg rarely let her visit. When Evelyn did come by, he was polite but firm, brushing off her questions and insisting that Amina was fine. "You're spoiling her," he said once when Evelyn brought over a homemade pie. "She needs to learn how to take care of herself." Amina wanted to scream that it wasn't true. She wanted to tell her grandmother everything: the hunger, the loneliness, the way Greg looked at her like she was a stain he couldn't scrub out. But the fear stopped her, fear of what he might do, fear of losing what little she had left. And so Amina stayed quiet, but something inside her knew that this was only the beginning. Days turned into weeks, and the shadows in Greg's house seemed to grow darker. Amina's world had shrunk to the walls of her bedroom, and the harsh voice that echoed through the halls gone. Were the sounds of laughter, the warm smells of cinnamon and vanilla, and the gentle hands that tucked her into bed. In their place was silence, heavy, suffocating, and cold. Greg's behavior shifted from indifference to cruelty. At first he barely acknowledged her existence, treating her more like an unwanted guest than a child in more. But as time passed, his hostility became more deliberate. It was in the way he looked at her, sharp, hard stares that made her stomach churn, and in the way he spoke, each word clipped and loaded with disdain. "You eat too much," he snapped one evening when Amina reached for a second slice of bread. "No wonder your kind always looks like beggars, greedy and lazy." Amina froze, her fingers tightening around the slice. She wanted to say something to defend herself, but the words caught in her throat. Instead she set the bread down and lowered her head, her appetite disappearing. Greg's comments became sharper, more frequent. He ridiculed her hair, calling it a mess of wires and threatening to cut it off if she didn't fix it when she tried to comb it the way her mother had taught her. He yanked the brush out of her hands and threw it across the room. "No one's going to take you seriously looking like that," he said. "You should be grateful I'm even letting you stay here. People like you should know their place." The words stung, but what hurt more was the look in his eyes, a coldness that made it clear he saw her as less than human. Amina learned to avoid him as much as possible. She tiptoed through the house, careful not to make noise, and spent hours in her room with the door closed. But even there she couldn't escape his voice. "You think hiding makes you invisible? You're not, you're just pathetic," he yelled one night after finding her sitting in the corner of her closet, hugging her knees. When she didn't respond, he stormed into the room and grabbed her by the arm, dragging her to her feet. "Stop crying," he shouted, shaking her. "You're not special, Amina, you're nothing." The tears stopped, but not because she wanted them to. They stopped because fear took over, wrapping itself around her like a heavy chain. At school things weren't any better. Amina's classmates picked up on the way she carried herself, shoulders hunched, eyes downcast, and took it as a sign of weakness. "Why does your hair look like that?" one girl asked, tugging at one of her braids. "Do you even have a dad?" another boy taunted. "Or did he leave like all the others?" Their words echoed the things Greg said at home, and Amina started to wonder if they were right. Teachers noticed her change in behavior but never pressed the issue. When Greg showed up for parent meetings, he put on a performance, smiling, shaking hands, and talking about how difficult it had been to raise Amina after her mother's death. "She's been acting out," he said, lowering his voice to make it seem like he was being discreet. "You know how kids are at this age, especially after a loss." No one questioned him. Even at home, Greg knew how to cover his tracks. When Evelyn visited, he made sure the house looked clean and that Amina Was dressed properly, he'd even cook a meal pretending to be the picture of a caring father. She's fine Evelyn, he said. Once when Evelyn commented on how thin Amina looked, you're overreacting, but Evelyn wasn't convinced. She started visiting more often, and each time she found new reasons to worry. Amina's silence, the dark circles under her eyes, the way she flinched at sudden movements. Evelyn tried to talk to Amina in private, but the girl wouldn't say anything. Greg had made it clear what would happen if she did. Please, she whispered one night standing outside his bedroom door. I'm hungry, but Greg didn't open the door. Amina spent the night curled up on the floor, her stomach growling. As the days dragged on, her isolation deepened. She stopped answering questions in class and stopped drawing pictures of her mother. It hurt too much to remember what she'd lost. Greg fed on her silence. He pushed, he